Good afternoon. How are you all? It's like I'm a faculty member here. If people don't quiet down, I'll definitely affect your final grades. Um, Welcome, and very happy to be here. My name is Jelani Cobb, and I am a faculty member at the Journalism School, and I will be moderating the discussion this afternoon. And I have, the honor and can you help? Oh, can you hear me? All right. Is this better? All right. So I have the honor of moderating this discussion between two really insightful journalists and people whose work I personally admire, and I suspect many of you do as well. So I will just introduce them, and then we'll get into the discussion. To my far left is Tanzina Vega. She is a host of The Takeaway on WNYC. As a journalist on WNYC Radio, as a journalist, she speaks on issues of race, media, and inequality in the United States. She is an Eisner Fellow at the Nation Institute, author of the forthcoming book Uppity, and a Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. Tanzina has contributed to CNN, CNN Money, CNYC Radio, Reuters Television, Billboard Magazine, and the New York Times, where she won an Emmy for Outstanding New Approaches in Documentary Media and various awards from the National Press Photographers Association. In the center is Adam Serwer, and he is a senior editor at The Atlantic, where he covers politics. He has a wide range of journalistic experience, from being a writing fellow with the American Prospect to being a reporter with Mother Jones and a national reporter with MSNBC. He's also worked as a contributing blogger for the Washington Post and as a national editor for BuzzFeed. And just very recently, in the last week, I was happy to be able to announce that he is winner of the Hillman Award, the Hillman Prize for Opinion and Commentary, and so for this year. So congratulations to that. Yes, we're going to turn our mics on.
Thank you.
So I guess I'll just start with this. We're at a very particular moment in our history, and that is reflected in the coverage is reflected in our politics, and seemingly kind of inescapable, especially as it pertains to issues of race and national politics. And I wondered if you could just talk for a moment about the work that you all do and the way that this has been, the things that you've been interested in, how you've been interested in, and how you've come to cover those things since 2016. I don't know. We can flip a coin.
Can you guys hear me? Well, since the 2016 election, most of my work has been devoted to excavating the historical antecedents to Trumpism. In 2017, I published a piece called The Nationalist Delusion, which was a combination of campaign reporting and quantitative analysis, and also historiography on past incidents that had influenced the development of Trump's politics. I recently published a piece in the magazine about the history of the white genocide conspiracy theory, which actually has its origins right here in New York City with a patrician New Yorker named Madison Grant, who came up with the concept of something called race suicide, which in his mind was the original white Anglo-Saxon inhabitants of the original 13 states were committing race suicide by importing immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, mainly Italians and Jews. And the way that argument has sort of resurfaced today, and you can hear it all over the place. And I think, since 2016, we've heard the refrain so frequently that, when things happen, particularly now that, Charlottesville's back in the news, but when Charlottesville happened, the response was sort of like, this isn't who we are, what's happened to us as a country. And the answer is more or less that this is, what we're seeing today is the culmination or the continuation of an argument that we've had since the founding, which is pretty much, is America a white Christian country, and is that really what it is? Or is it a place where anybody can be an American regardless of where they come from, as long as they believe in the American idea. So I guess I'll just hand it over to Tanzina.
Sure. In 2016, I was still at CNN, went to Princeton to teach race and how to report on race in America today, and segued into becoming host of a national radio show that has a footprint of almost more than 250 stations around the country and about 2.7 million listeners Monday through Thursday. No pressure. And podcasts and online downloads and live streams and all that. And my coming into covering race, for those of you who follow my work, is not new. Something that I've done, either from the outside, looking in when I was a media reporter, or directly at the New York Times when I decided to just cover it head on. But obviously that conversation has evolved. And there have been a couple of turning points in the past decade, and I think one of them was the events at Ferguson, which sort of changed the dynamic, changed the way we report, we talk about race, we cover race, and one of those other ones was the 2016 election. Since then, I've written, a lot of my work at CNN really focused on inequality, looking at the wealth gap and how race factors into that. And that plays out in everything from incarceration and the financial costs of incarceration to healthcare and beyond. And some themes started to emerge while I was working there that I've really used as the focus for my work at The Takeaway. I mentioned the wealth gap. That was something that I dug into quite a bit while I was at CNN, and I'm now hearing political candidates using the term like nothing, and it's pretty surprising actually to hear that. Part of that to me is I want to explain what underlies all of the things that we're seeing. I think so often we hear news, it's a commodity, it's a headline, and we just don't, we keep moving, we keep scrolling, we keep watching, we keep tweeting, but we're not really understanding where this is coming from. And I think as a complement to the type of work that Adam and Jelani do, like being in public radio, is an opportunity to reach people that may not have heard these conversations before, potentially reaching new audiences, but really with the lens on these three gaps that I identify in American society. One is the wealth gap. We know that white families have 11 to 13 times the wealth of black families and Latino families in this country. There are reasons for that. The 1% in the United States is 95% white. That's according to data from the St. Louis Fed that I was able to get from. And so that's one gap that underpins a lot of what we deal with in a capitalist country like this. But there are two other gaps that have emerged. One is an empathy gap. I remember being at CNN and writing about the white working class and this sort of empathy that a lot of the candidates were asking directly or indirectly for Americans to have for a community that was rightly suffering, that was rightly dealing with issues like drug addiction, like overdose, like income, issues, the broken families. There was a big report, I think, in the Brookings Center that came out with a report that really, as I was reading it, I said, wait, but this sounds like a lot of what communities of color have been dealing with for decades, right? But there doesn't seem to be the same empathy. We don't seem to look at these two groups with the same type of empathy, and why is that? And since I've been at The Takeaway, I think politically we've seen that empathy gap just grow, and particularly with the situation on the southern border. I think there's a real lack of understanding of this sort of social contract in the United States and what that means for us, not just as individuals, because we do that really well, right? We do us really, really well. We don't do us really well. And so that's kind of a thing that I'm trying to explore in the show as well. And then the third gap is the truth gap. And I think you can look at this from a number of different angles, but really what is considered fact, and that's the business that we traffic in, right? We traffic in the business of fact, or so we hope that's what we're doing. And unfortunately, that's becoming more and more difficult, whether it's through fake news or things being shared on social media, or the media itself being attacked. And so those are the three areas that I tend to focus my work on. And one of the things that we think is important at the takeaway, or I think as the host is important, is for us to connect the dots. There was a big conversation this week about felon disenfranchisement, particularly after the marathon town halls that CNN did earlier in the week. Some of the candidates said, how they felt about people who were incarcerated being able to vote versus those who were on the, had already served their time being able to vote. But one thing that got lost in the conversation was, who are we talking about when we're talking about incarcerated Americans, right? When we're talking about incarcerated Americans, we're talking about, regardless of race, we're talking about largely low-income, poor Americans, whether they're white, black, or brown. But then we look at the disparate numbers of black and brown Americans who are incarcerated. This now gives us context for a conversation about who is disenfranchised in the United States. And so that was a segment we did. We actually led the show with that segment yesterday to talk about things like gerrymandering and how that's an outgrowth often of these different policies that we're seeing. And in fact, Florida, for example, just said, yeah, you guys can vote. We'll give ex-felons the right to vote. 67% of the state voted for that, which for Floridians is a big deal to have that much of a majority. But the state legislature said you can do that provided you pay. Right? So now we have another, you pay any of your debt obligations that were related to the crime or civil obligations, civil financial obligations. And so that adds another layer to the question of, well, why are we continuing to put roadblocks in front of Americans who've already served their time? And we have to remember that who those Americans are. They're poor men and women, and they're largely black and brown. So that's kind of how we frame the conversation on the takeaway.
So, there's a lot there. And I think I want to start though with some of the things about how we've covered these things outside of the work that you all do, the context in which that happens. And so, at the Atlantic, there's one conversation that I hear, from the work that you're doing. There are other people I won't name who have different perspectives on these things. And when we talked about the empathy gap that you're talking about here, there have been some fairly absurdist instances, and what comes to mind immediately, I think, is the New York Times white nationalist next door story. And so I just wondered what all you think is generating this dynamic of the way in which we've covered, and if we went back to 2016, there was this huge kind of back and forth in which you can almost kind of, unfortunately, color coordinate the way these arguments were coming out, in that there were largely white journalists who were talking about the animating factor of Trump voters being, what was the euphemism, economic anxiety? And then other people going, no, not really. These dudes with the Klan hoods, I'm not really sure that's what this is. What do you think is about?
I think there's two factors that went into the surplus of those stories. That the genre of story that you're referring to, I refer to as the souls of white folks story. I think there's two things that go into it. One is that the composition of newsrooms is not particularly diverse. It's getting a little better, but it is overall the newsrooms reflect a particular race and class perspective, and it's one that if you I think that in general, media outlets want to avoid implying that their readers, their viewers, their audience might be racist. And so what you have is sort of a development of euphemism to avoid being that direct with readers, because you don't want to lose them because they feel like you've insulted them. But what that also means is that, the truth is ultimately warped by your commercial incentives as a media outlet. And I think that the second factor is honestly that for the most part, I think journalists, I think for the most part, we as an industry don't do a wonderful job of providing the historical context for certain things. We just sort of report, this study says this, or the latest survey says this, or, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says this, but we don't really we don't often offer the necessary historical context to describe particularly racial inequality when it comes up, and if we did, then I wouldn't be writing the things that I'm writing. But I think those are the two major factors.
Mm-hmm.
I think we also have to be honest about how, media, again, the media is a really big term, but if you're talking about, places like the Times, et cetera, media organizations are shrinking, right? So they don't have the presence in a lot of these places that were undercover to begin with, right? So I think a lot of the reaction was, oh my God, we totally missed this group of people. There's all of these Americans. Who are they? We've got to figure it out. So it was reactive. A lot of that felt really reactive. And now it sort of became a beat almost, right? We'll go out and we'll do the economic anxiety beat, or the, as you called it, the souls of white folks beat, right? I don't think there's anything inherently wrong in doing good reporting on this, but it felt a little off. Some of it didn't necessarily feel like it was reported, or it was reported without context. And I think that context is something that's missing. I think newsrooms have trouble with issues like this, with these bigger social structural issues like racism, right? Because it's uncomfortable, because of the lack of diversity, because it's often attributed to intent, right? Versus the impact. We often, and if you're, I'm sure there are some lawyers in here who will probably say, impact, can you prove intent versus impact, right? Can you prove disparate impact, that a certain group of people have been impacted by something, or is it all about, I'm not a racist, I wouldn't do that, my intent, right? People get very uncomfortable around the conversation of race when it comes to that, and I think if we treat this as part of our American history, and I think what's happening now is forcing us to acknowledge these uglier parts of our history that we've been able to gloss over and perhaps report around and sort of do this because I don't see a lot of economic anxiety stories anymore. Mm-hmm. The beat is dead, right? Nobody's interested anymore, right? Mm-hmm. Think about that. If they're really, that's not to suggest economic anxiety wasn't real. Mm-hmm. It was just something that people got really excited about, and suddenly we're not hearing the Trump supporter story from the diner anymore. And that suggests an inconsistency in viewing the country and following a story through, that I think is a real problem, because it's the bright, shiny object. It's not, this is a part of our society that we have to reckon with, and this is how it's played out. If you don't like the emotional element of racism, that's okay. You can look at the disparate impact that it's had. The numbers will tell you the story. And that I think we've had a lot of trouble acknowledging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think it was the fact that these people were being covered. It was the framing. Exactly. Which was sort of designed almost as a rebuttal to an imagined accusation. Right. Yeah.
But I guess it was strange from the beginning because, and this was, I guess, goes to a lack of critical insight or analysis on the part of editors or producers or whoever it is, but I've remained perplexed that we even have such a term as white working class. Like, what is that? Like,
one of the stories I did for CNN was literally the headline, which I hate this headline, but was, what about the black working class? Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, that was because it was so absurd that when we talk about working class America, that's the image that we think, right? Mm-hmm. I am from a working class family, right? Mm-hmm. I just felt really ignored in that mm-hmm. whole conversation, right? When we think about working class, we think about the factory floor, the good old American overalls, the lunch pail. That was a part of this mythic America that we continue to want to hold on to, or at least this last political cycle was trying to sell, that sort of myth of making America great and mm-hmm. taking it back. The working class being solely white is completely wrong. I mean, and so that was part of my, my almost incredulity of writing that story was like, well, how can we talk about this without talking about black and brown Americans who are really the backbone of a lot of the working class of America?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the fact that you even distinguish suggests the importance of the history there.
Right. I mean, it's implicitly a kind of nationalist statement to say that we're going to talk about the working class, but the specific segment of it, that there were no headlines going the Latino working class, and I don't think that was something that people thought about. And so, I mean, we've had a lot of postmortems about what went wrong in 2016, and some of the dynamics that led to skewed coverage and lots of other problematic things about that election cycle. I wonder what you see at the outset of the current election cycle, and whether or not you see things being replicated. Are people more cognizant of it, or
yes and no?
Mm-hmm.
Yes and no. I think what's concerning, I called out a couple things this week, headlines in particular that I thought were problematic, and I hate that word problematic, but I really mean that they were problematic.
The internet ruined problematic.
It really did.
Problematic
It, cancel, I can't say any of these
all those
things.
things,
Like,
right.
I can't, but really not great. Can I just say something? And part of the reason why was because we're consuming media now in very different ways than we were even 2 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. The amount of headline traffic that how many of you are actually reading every article you're retweeting? Exactly. Or Facebook posting? Exactly. All the way to the end, kicker and all? Exactly. So my point is, you're sharing things, not necessarily even talking about fake news. I'm talking about headlines are the thing that you're sharing. Our news has become so quick and so small in a way. I'm thinking about like I can't come up with the word other than now. Problematic has really been the problem. But we're just sharing these
troublesome.
pieces.
How about troublesome? Right.
I like that. So we're sharing these snippets of news without really getting them. And what those snippets of news are doing is they create the narrative now, right? So now we're seeing a narrative that's being created really just driven by headlines without any context. And that to me is a huge mistake. There were two headlines that I saw this week. One that sort of, the Times actually ran that I thought, Times doesn't usually run question headlines on news analysis stories, right? And it was a question about who should be, it was about the citizenship question on the census, right? Loved that the piece was analysis, it was fantastic. The headline was really misleading. Should non-citizens, be allowed to vote? Well, I mean, yeah, if you ask it like that without a context of the Constitution and all the other things, so it just was, that felt to me a little disingenuous that the Times did that. CNN also had a similar headline about, comparing Elizabeth Warren as the professor and Mayor Pete as the sort of, the guy who hands in his homework late and who do we think we really like best. And I'm like, without even getting to the piece, the headline is creating a narrative. And I think the media has been pretty clear about who they're interested in, right? And creating that narrative around those candidates. I think they need to do better.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other issue is that you've got related to the issue of racism in the United States, you've got a president whose appeals to his base are largely racialized, and he relies to a certain extent on news organizations uncritically repeating his words in headlines, so that people are getting the message almost without, they may not read the article, but they're like, Trump says there are terrorists in the migrant caravan. So if you read that, you might think, oh man, there are terrorists in that caravan? That's pretty scary. I mean, and then when you read the article, it's like, Mr. Trump with no evidence said blah, blah. I was like, okay, well, it's too late. And I think that it's just extremely easy for things to, because of the dynamic that Tanzina just identified, it's extremely easy for not even claims that are intended to be misleading, but are intended to be informative, that are done by professional journalists, not by propagandists, end up sort of tricking people into thinking something that isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
And because we're all, there's this competition for the thing that makes you want to retweet and click and post and share. A lot of journalism is under pressure now for metrics, unfortunately. And so, that I think is leading to some of these. And I have nothing against sexy headlines. I think if done well, they serve the right purpose. They but if they create narratives, particularly around really sensitive topics like who's running for president, or the sensitive topic what's happening at the southern border. I think that if it's opinion, let it be opinion. Let it be clear that this is opinion. If it's news analysis, we should be clear that that's that. We run the risk of making many similar mistakes, and we've lost a lot of trust.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The media, for better or worse, whether it's our fault or not, the attacks on the press have really, I think, had an impact in how Americans see us and what we do. And so it's even more important that I think we take this really seriously.
So I think this, in terms of this thing about losing a lot of trust, is something that happened, and it has been discussed in some outlets, but probably under discussed. And with the Mueller report being released and the points about Sarah Sanders, Huckabee Sanders, being caught outright lying, admitting that she has outright lied about the context of James Comey's firing, and then kind of reversing herself in public after that. If we were thinking about Kellyanne Conway and the profligate untruths, myriad untruths that have that she's proffered in media outlets. It's curious to me that there seems to be, for all of these kinds of questions about being, fake news or being not trusted by the public, it seems that there's been a curious tolerance for repeat offenders and people who seem to have no compunction whatsoever about lying to the public, but still gaining access to public forums. And I had this conversation with a person who I won't name, who I direct messaged when Kellyanne Conway was going to be on that particular show, and I just raised the question of, do you have any ethical worries about putting out someone who has told the public so many things that are not true? And they felt that simply the position warranted giving this person an audience.
Well, I think, every administration lies. The Obama administration lied. The Bush administration definitely lied. The Clinton administration lied. You're not going to find a presidential administration that does not try to mislead the public. I think the distinction with this administration is that we've seen them lie about things that everybody knows are not true, that you can see with your own eyes, and that's really startling. I mean, I still go back to that first press conference with Sean Spicer, acting like Baghdad Bob and just being like, oh yeah, this was the biggest audience for any inauguration ever, while you're staring at an empty photo
space,
of the mall.
right?
And that set the tone for the administration, which is just, we can lie. The press will repeat our lies even if they're debunking them. And the fact is that because of the nature of the American press, it has to at least look like it's striving to show both sides of the conversation, particularly on cable news programs. So, there's no way to avoid, what Trump official are you going to get to come on CNN or MSNBC who has not told a whopper before? Because they all go on there and they all go on to try and impress the president. Mm-hmm. So they say outrageous things that they know aren't true, but that they know that he's going to like. Mm-hmm. So I think in general, the press is in a tough position because they can't take their usual posture of, this thing is happening on both sides in equal measure.
Mm-hmm. We also have choices we make every day. Mm-hmm. I've never had Kellyanne Conway on The Takeaway, at least not this year. Mm-hmm. And so, it's also incumbent upon editors, directors, producers to make the choices that they think, make sense. And they're obviously, and I think it extends beyond Kellyanne Conway to even a lot of the way cable news often, I think it hires political operatives and has them as analysts, but then doesn't really make that clear to the audience. Is this person a journalist? Is it a not? Did they work for the Trump campaign? Are they in with the Obamas? It's very unclear, I think, the way folks sort of go in and out of these different roles. And so I think that's a product of something that, of having the demands of having to have 24 hours a day filled with something, right? Which is a lot of what cable news, but that's not an excuse. Mm-hmm. Right? There are choices that you can make with what you fill your airtime with, and we make them every day. Now, I don't have 24 hours to fill. I have 1 hour, so my choices are different. But I do think it's a choice.
Mm-hmm. So I wondered, going back to this point that you raised about who constitutes newsrooms or the masthead in the publication, has this moment been particularly difficult or presented particular difficulties for people of color, for women, for people who are historically underrepresented in the media in terms of covering race and everything that's going on in national politics right now?
I think it's a little less internal in newsrooms. I think newsrooms, hopefully because of efforts like mine and what a lot of the work that we all have done to kind of bring attention to this issue, are more sensitive, I think, to the issue, at least on the optics. But I think it's become difficult internally. I think it's okay to share that, right? If journalists have feelings, we're human. Yeah, those of you who'd like to believe that we are. And I do think that I'm hearing from a lot of folks that it can be tiring, because we're not in a, not just, it's the pace of the news cycle is insane, right? And we all signed up for that and we kind of expect that. But then there's a deeper feeling here of fear and of being attacked. And, I remember the day, every time I think about Jamal Khashoggi, for example, I'm terrified. It not only breaks my heart, I get really, images in my mind of what had happened, what this person tried to do. I think about the day that the journalists were killed in Maryland.
Yeah.
At the Capitol Gazette. And I remember coming into work the next day and there were cops in front of the station and thinking, this is our new reality, right? And it's not so much about being self-serving, it's all about us. No, but it's about the environment has shifted, right? For as much as there's an awareness of we need diversity and women of color and people of color and LGBTQ communities, et cetera, there's also this flip side, this other side to the binary, which is we really hate all of these things, all of these people, and pretty much everything that you stand for, just by walking the face of the earth. So that's a shift, I think. And I think it's one that can wear on you. And I think, I guess that's where that other phrase, self-care, all that stuff comes in. But I do think that's to me been the shift.
Adam?
I think a big part of what source of what you're talking about is the access that readers have to journalists now. I mean, obviously we're very much out there on social media and stuff like that. So, I mean, I can vaguely recall what it was like before you could just like say something or write something and not expect like 50 people to come in and call you horrible names. And it's much worse for women and it's much worse for women of color. But I mean, I think that, the extent to which you have to weather nasty remarks about your identity if you are a religious or ethnic minority or a woman and a journalist at the same time, I think is a little different. I mean, I don't want to say that it's worse than like the 1960s or whatever, because I don't think that's the case. But I do think it is different in terms of the access that these people have to you. Through your phone and through just like they can just talk to you and they can say whatever they want and it can be something horrible and crazy. So I think that has a lot to do with sort of the emotional wear and tear of this particular moment, in part because also, sometimes these guys are just nasty strangers and sometimes it's people who are actively trying to come after you personally because of something that you said or did.
I mean, it's remarkable, to Tanzina's point, that we actually had a moment where there were bombs being mailed to media organizations and prominent liberal politicians, and that's not even in the top 10 things we think about in terms of media news in the past year.
Just stunning, right? You think
Right.
about that, it's absolutely stunning. And the reality is, I think as journalists, we tend to say, well, let's just turn on the chip and go do what we have to do and take our feelings out of it. And we do that, and we do that really well. But as human beings, I think anybody that works in an environment where you're constantly under that type of stress, you have to be honest about it. It's terrifying.
I have just another question I want to slip in because we have people who ask questions for a living in the audience. So I want to make sure we have time for more questions than usual. Although I will give you my standard, it's not personal, my standard disclaimer. A question is a request for information as typically identified by an inflection at the end of the sentence. In grammar, we note this with a question mark, interrogative sentence. So we would like concise interrogative sentences. By concise, we mean 30 seconds or less. And so, having given that disclaimer, I'll ask my last question.
I'm stealing that.
I'm telling you, you just have to, because like, I went to some place and this guy, I swear he read his doctoral dissertation. And at the end of it, I was kind of like, was that a footnote or a question? Like, where are we? So I want to ask about stories that you think are being covered right now, that you think are being covered poorly or not covered at all, or maybe not to the extent that they should be, and kind of looking out at the landscape and saying what you think could be done better.
I think about that one for a minute. I feel like we're overloaded.
It's really hard for me to answer that question because for every story I can think on a topic that was done extremely poorly, I can think of a reporter who's doing a really great job on it. So like the New York Times had that like really terrible headline after the Barr letter came out, saying that Barr had misrepresented the findings of the Mueller report, but the New York Times didn't know that, but they should have hedged or done something to make sure that they were clear to their readers that they were not conveying the contents of the Mueller report, but the assessment of the president's handpicked attorney general. But then, of course, you have Charlie Savage putting up Barr's quotations of Mueller right next to those sections in the Mueller report, which is just, you don't even need to say anything. You can see for yourself. I mean, there's not a lot of issues that I can think of that are being covered where there isn't someone who's doing like a really good job covering them. What I will say is I think that in general, it is almost always the case that when people of color, religious minorities end up in the newspaper, they either end up there because of a negative issue with which they are associated, or because they have overcome the negative issue with which they are associated, which means that you are the reader. It creates an association in the mind of the reader that is extremely hard to break. So there's a book called White Backlash, which is about it's an extremely well done political science book showing that white Americans have been leaving the Democratic Party most likely because of immigration, and it was published a year before Trump. So it's not an ex post facto. It's not trying to explain his rise. And one of the things that it noticed was that even when it looked in papers like the so-called quote-unquote liberal media, the New York Times, immigrants were almost always being covered in a way that was negative. There's no, and I'm not saying like there's somebody at the Times or at the Post or something that's saying here's how we're going to cover immigration negatively and here's how we're going to do it. It's just a thing that happens because of the nature of the way that we cover the news, and I'm not sure what the answer to that question is other than to cover those communities in depth and insightful ways that don't simply involve talking about the problem that makes them relevant to people who are not from that community. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing, by the way. But I think I'm not sure how else you get around this phenomenon, which is just something that shapes, particularly for people who never come in contact with these communities, completely shapes their perception of who they are.
And I think to piggyback off of that, I think one of the things I see in lacking is, I don't think we should have this whole diversity for diversity's sake of diversity, because then it becomes a meaningless thing, right? Because then what happens is you have, people of color either put into low-level reporting jobs and just end up staying there. The typical route is Metro desk, and then who knows, where you end up. I would like to see more journalists of color, more women, more people who are non-traditional journalists in investigatory roles, in politics reporting. I feel like I always tell people I covered race because I made a choice to do that, right? But I would hate to have had that imposed on me because of who I am. I had someone say to me once, so you're the Hispanic affairs reporter. I said, we don't even have a Hispanic affairs beat, but I'll take it. But I see what you're saying. I'm covering race more broadly. Okay, we'll get there. But But I do think that that was just the beginning. I think we need to see, you know, a lot of the Pulitzer Prizes and all this big stuff that we allow journalists to dig into. We often don't allow that journalists of color to do those types of stories, to get in deep. And no, they don't have to be, if you're a person of color, you have to cover the race beat. You know, I covered technology for years and media and all of these other things where I was really the only person in the room. And I think that's how you really start to change the perspective. Don't just put people of color in race beats, put them in all beats, you know, and let's see what comes out of that.
So if you have questions, you can line up. There's a microphone here, and we'll try to, excuse me?
Well,
Okay. And so we will make sure that we get these in just very concisely. Let's just say one thing in response to what you said, Tanzina. I get the opposite here. And it's a question, the first time I got it, I actually laughed because I didn't realize it was a serious question. I thought the person was joking, and then I felt bad about it. But I've subsequently gotten it maybe at least 30 times. And that question, the question I get is the opposite of this, which is that very often white students or white journalists who are graduated and beyond you know, this institution ask me if it's okay for them to cover stories involving race. And I was like, oh, no, yeah, we really, really need you to cover these stories. Because for one, you don't want to have that pressure of putting people of color on their own kind of professional sharecropping system. It's like, this set aside is what you'll be doing.
Exactly.
And secondly, for the hot button kinds of issues, you don't want the person of color always having to stick their neck out. And we were just at a conference yesterday at Harvard. We were saying there was someone in the room, there might have been a black person in the room when they made that Ancestry.com, that terrible Ancestry.com commercial. He was like, shh, no, I'm not gonna let you, I'm not
gonna be the one.
Right, exactly, I'm not going to referee you out of this one. And so it creates this wrongful dynamic. And besides the fact, what we really want and what we really need is for these issues to be covered with the same sort of diligence and care and professionalism that people who cover national affairs, people who cover the economy, people who cover Wall Street, who cover the Senate, like those sorts of things, they don't say, should I cover the environment or anything because of my background. And I think that was one of the things that's been most notable about this.
Yes, the answer is not to bring people of color in your newsroom and give them all the work you don't want to do.
Right, exactly.
Or have them do the two jobs, their
Yeah.
job and then the race checking police job.
Oh, you mean we in the
Race
CJR,
ombudsman.
The CYA job.
the CYA job, or as we came across this term in the Columbia Journalism Review issue we did on diversity, which was black checking.
Yes. Yeah, brown, black, yes. All the women checking, yes,
Right,
yes.
exactly.
Can you read this before, you know? And I get it. I understand there's
Right.
sensitive. But when you're the only person,
Right.
you're like, okay, maybe I should just write it.
Yeah, I mean, I was in a situation once where I like black checked something. I was like, no, it should be fine. And then black people lost their minds.
Right,
Like,
right. If you get
I
it
was like,
wrong.
hey, I was like, you know, I mean, this is an art, not a science. Like,
Don't get it wrong, Jelani.
I was just relying on what I thought my cousin would say about it. And so, there you go.
okay, well, in terms of race, power, and politics, like we all know the shock at the 2020 election when Trump was elected, and 2016.
Oh, God,
and
please don't say that.
2020 hasn't shocked me yet. And I'm just wondering, like, what's the issue that's going to be missed in the 2020 election, as we're already getting into nonstop coverage? We're already bored with the 2020 election. It's been so totally covered. So what's going to be missed this time around?
The gravity of what we just experienced in terms of the criminality of this administration, I think. That's honestly something I think is we're just, you know, this is serious. This is real serious. If this was happening in any other country, I think we'd be covering it quite differently. And the implications that this has for that election, right?
We'd be sending in election observers
Literally.
if it was any other country.
Literally. So I think that we're just like, oh, wow, this other thing happened. That's pretty intense. Let's keep moving. Look, there's an election, right? Yeah.
What's interesting what you said about the question about is it okay for a white person to cover these issues. I started my career in the black press, but nowadays it's, I think, an issue of appropriation and all that stuff. But anyway, my question is reparations. Is the media doing enough coverage of this issue? Is the media ready or informed enough to deal with this issue? And is the American public ready to hear about it?
And so if you didn't hear in the back, she asked about reparations and saying, was the media doing enough to cover it? Was the public ready to I guess, hear about this issue? Mm-hmm. Is that a good summation of it? Mm-hmm.
We just covered this on the takeaway about 2 weeks ago. We did a very in-depth discussion with Maxine Crump, who is a descendant of slaves, Catherine Franke, who's here at Columbia University, and Nkechi, and I'm blanking on Nkechi's last name. Taifa. Yeah. And this was a robust discussion. Keep in mind, all women having the discussion, which I thought was quite interesting, about an issue that I think is often misunderstood in this country. And the context around reparations is misunderstood. Why we have it goes back to the wealth gap, why this is even in the conversation. So yeah, I think it needs to be covered. The intersection of race and money to me is critical. And I encourage you to listen to our segment if you get a chance.
I mean, again, this is something where some journalists have done incredible work and some people have been dismissive and uninformed. I think, whether or not we're ready for it, it's a part of the 2020 primary conversation among Democrats. So, we'll see.
Hi, my name is Joey, class of 2014. For some context, I'm a member of the communication staff at the ACLU of Florida. So we're on the front lines of felony disenfranchisement
yes.
and anti-sanctuary cities. So we're doing the messaging, trying to combat that. My question is, hold on 1 second. Okay. Today's political climate is emboldening leaders to be outwardly bigoted, and journalists and communicators of color are often on the front lines of receiving and reporting those messages. Could any of you offer any advice to them on self-care and keeping the focus on the work at hand?
My wife takes away my phone. Seriously, I mean, sometimes, obviously, if you're in a situation where you're in physical danger, that's not going to solve your problem. But I do think that we, in terms of self-care, sometimes it's okay to just stay away from the internet for a little while, especially if you are not obligated professionally to be on it at that time. And I think I honestly think it's just one of those things. The internet has made it so that we're all working all the time. And you really just have to. I have a friend who, she's Jewish. She started turning off her phone on Shabbos. She doesn't, she's not so religious that she turns off the lights or, she doesn't cook, whatever. But she just turns off her phone on Shabbos and doesn't turn it back on, and it's kind of amazing. So I do think that's one thing that I think definitely helps, particularly if you are in the midst of some sort of extremely stressful social media event.
I think about when Rachel Maddow had that moment on MSNBC where she started crying on television after there were babies that were found to be separated and from their parents, and that was a moment, and it happened, and it was a very human moment, whether you like Rachel Maddow or don't like her. I think that was a rare moment of, wow, we're breaking the fourth wall almost of how we as journalists are supposed to be. The stresses are real, the concerns are real. I turn off my phone, I listen to comedy. I try to just watch, I love Antiques Roadshow. It sounds stupid, right? But it's I want to see something that has nothing to do with any of this. And I also try, and I think you're seeing a lot of news organizations doing good news newsletters, right? There's a reason for that. And I think it's because this is depressing stuff we're talking about. It really is. And it's funny how we can have conversations about mental health in the abstract, but not in the real, in real time, right? a lot of people are feeling stressed out right now. There's a lot of this happening. So I think we have to be like, open about it, acknowledge it, and not treat it as sort of like this self-care as it's become one of these like memes, but actually what does that look like, right? It means I haven't, I was like, I need to go to the dentist. I mean, like, I haven't even done that. I mean, really, like, basic things. I haven't seen my mom. Like, why am I setting up meetings with other people when I need to see my family, And I think journalists can get really caught up in that. And also just, realizing that you have a finite amount of time, in every day, and really being strong about, setting boundaries around that, which is hard to do when you're chasing the story on Twitter, but you have to do it. The minute I feel the heart palpitations on Twitter, I'm like, I've got to step back. I don't care if I'm ratioed or whatever the latest thing is. I don't care. Like, put it down.
Hi, I'm Jim Ostroff. To what extent do you feel has the proliferation of very narrowly focused self-interest groups on social media contributed to, I would say, a rise of racism in this country? That forum did not exist until recently. It does now. I'd be interested in your thoughts about that. Question mark.
So
I appreciate that.
I don't think it's social media per se. I think the internet has definitely united people who have terrible views who before would have had a hard time finding each other. But I think that's not necessarily a social media thing. I mean, look, people tend to forget this, but in 2006, Bush's immigration bill, which was meant to legalize, millions of people, undocumented people in this country, was killed by a right-wing backlash, and it was huge. And it didn't have anything to do with social media. It was all talk radio and stuff like that. I mean, it is a sort of comforting feeling to try and think that there's something about this technology that is making us insane, but it's actually more like we were already insane and we're using the technology to make each other crazier. These problems pre-exist the divisions of social media, which are, for people like us who are extremely online are very bad, but the truth is that it's something like 10% of Twitter users do like 90 to 95% of tweets. Most people are on Twitter like, I guess I'm gonna get a burger today. Or like they're sharing like a funny meme, or they're talking to their friends. It's not the same thing that like we do. So I think, sometimes the internet can make things seem a lot crazier than they actually are. But it is definitely true that people who otherwise would have been isolated and might have been forced to change their behavior in a way to make them fit into larger society have now found each other and are enabling each other's worst impulses.
Jelani, please don't kill me for this question, but I just feel like I need to give a little context. So
As long as it has an inflection at the end,
I'll
and there's 30 seconds or less,
I'll
we'll
take
be
the
good.
gentleman before me as a call and put in a question mark for you. But I'm South Asian, so I have a perspective of a South Asian, and I do feel that when we talk about race and politics, or race specifically, a lot of times Asians and South Asians aren't necessarily mentioned. When you talk about inequality, you talk about black and white, Latino oftentimes, and I feel like there were a lot of stories that were missed in terms of South Asians and Asians. And I've always pitched stories and been told, that doesn't affect a lot of people, so we're not really interested. And I bring this up because of the Stuyvesant High School story that recently came out. You read the story and you think, oh, this is a school, not that there's anything wrong with being white, but this is a school filled with white people, so it's not diverse. But it's not. It's a school that had so many Asians in it, who worked really hard. A lot of them came from, more disadvantaged economic statuses. So my question for you is, do you think that South Asians should be covered more? Do you think we're not doing a good enough job about it? And then how do you go up to an editor? And how do you prove that this story is worth covering, even if it only affects or only talks about Asians and South Asians?
So hi Sonia, how are you? Couple things there, because I agree. I think Asian Americans as a group, like Latino Americans, like all Americans of color, are often lumped into big categories. I think Asian Americans, first of all, are the fastest growing group of non-white Americans, so we have to remember that's one of the big reasons why your editor should be paying attention. It's a huge, fast-moving group. Asian Americans also at the average wealth. Now, I did a story about this at CNN. At the average wealth, it's higher than white families, right? But when you disaggregate that data, you start seeing historical pockets of inequity within Asian American communities, in particular in New York City, okay, which has one of the poorest Asian American communities, Cambodians, Hmong populations, et cetera. Those stories are hard to tell, but that does not make it, we haven't even scratched the surface of Asian American voting power, right, and where this community is headed. So without covering a community, that's what the problem you have when you parachute in and say, okay, we're going to do this. There's Asian Americans here. We got to cover this, right? And we don't know who to talk to. We have nothing about the community. We have not engaged with the community, right? One of the first stories I did on the New York Times Race Beat was about Asian Americans, specifically Cambodians in Pennsylvania, who and the sort of the retirement issues that issues that people have when taking care of elders, right? And how that culture changes when you come to the United States. You're expected to take care of your elders, but this new culture that you're in doesn't allow for that. Language, food, all these things come in. It took months to report out. For years, I would go to parties and people would be like, my God, I read that story, right? It's not about me. It's about that people were like, oh my God, we're seeing stories about a community that are nuanced, right, and reported. And so I don't know who your editor is, but they should really give that a second look.
Yeah, I have nothing to say except that's a bad editor.
Yeah.
Can I add one quick thing as a kind of moderator's prerogative? There are two political figures who I would point out to that editor who are really significant in terms of what they're doing or what they will do in the near future, and that's Nikki Haley and Tulsi Gabbard. And Nikki Haley won because she's going to be a national figure very quickly. I mean, she already is because of the UN ambassadorship, but she'll be a significant factor in Republican politics, probably whatever happens post-Trump. And the other is that Tulsi Gabbard may or may not be going anywhere in terms of her presidential aspirations, but her relationship with the Modi government in India is significant and interesting, and it's something that people should think about because this is a domestic politician who, because of her ancestry, has foreign policy implications in terms of whatever else she does. And then the other part of it, which is that I had an interesting conversation with a colleague here who is of Indian descent about Kamala Harris. And the ways in which African Americans are like, oh yeah, sure, she's one of us, and he was like, yeah, Indians are like, yeah, sure, she's one of us, and basically like, she is bridging this very unusual gap in a way that people don't really typically think about, and doing a really adept job of it. Like, I don't think that those two things are seen in conflict in any particular way.
And just one thing I'll add is that sometimes that argument is because they don't think there's an audience for it, right? It's not that there aren't enough. They don't think, well, why is anybody going to care about this population if they're not that population? And the problem there is not seeing a good story for a good story, regardless of who it's about, right? And let's judge stories based on the merit the same way we would if that community wasn't Asian American. That community was, any other community, and you said, look, I've got a great story, period.
Hi, Mariana Katsarova. I'm class of 92. I'm actually the first Bulgarian, East European, who came to this school, but I'm not going to talk about Bulgarians in the power and politics discussion. But I'm having a bit of a deja vu, and I raised this 2 years ago in the same discussion. Why is that when there is a race discussion in this country, the topic of Native Americans and First Nation people is absolutely non-existent? Maybe because they're so discriminated, annihilated, that they're not, they're not the story, they're not the leaders, they're not the journalists writing the stories. Or if there is a story, it has to be something horrendous about their poverty or their alcoholism or whatever it is, but even that is not the story, the social issues on the ghettos of the reservations. I wish I had the money. I wish I became not a human rights advocate after J-School, but a multimillionaire banker. What I would do as a Bulgarian alumni, actually I would set up, if I had the money, a scholarship for Columbia Journalism School for a Native American young men and women, and particularly women, to come and be these journalists of the future. Because otherwise we can't move from this point. I mean, even, with all my love for your discussion and for you guys, look at the composition of this panel. We don't have that alumni from First Nation people in this country. What are your thoughts? Thank you.
The takeaway covers Native issues extensively. I'd encourage you to listen to our show. We've done segments at least once a week on an issue relating to that community because we see that it's undercovered. The numbers, I also say, are often a challenge. When you look for data on Native American and populations, it's very difficult to find. That's not an excuse for not covering stories, and so we know that. I do think these are also communities that don't have resources often to cover. There are Native Americans journalists. There are Native American Journalists Organization, like there are the three other, the National Association of Black Journalists, Hispanic journalists, and Native American journalists and Asian American journalists. So we have them. It's often the smallest population. It's a very small population. It's undercovered, and I agree that's why we're trying to do more coverage on our show.
Yeah, and actually give voices to their journalists, not just
that's what we
making
do.
them a
We
story.
don't speak for
Excellent.
them. We have them on and have them.
Excellent.
Yeah.
There was an interesting development, by the way, in 2018, which is something that you hadn't seen before. Civil rights advocates knew about this, but you hadn't seen the amount of media coverage on voter suppression of Native Americans that you saw in 2018, because one of the things that
They really put their foot in it in 2006.
yeah, they really did. And one of the things that even going back 20 years ago when I was a graduate student and moonlighting as a writer for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, one of the things that was clear was that the Voting Rights Act, which is primarily associated with African Americans, has implications for all sorts of groups that people don't think about. And even back then, people were talking about, lawyers were talking about its implications for Native Americans, as well as immigrant populations, making sure that you have to have ballot materials and the language that people are most adept at speaking, and all sorts of other kinds of ways that make democracy more inclusive. So that was one of the things I thought was a hopeful sign last year.
Hi, Jerome Sherman, class of 2004. Thank you for this discussion. Adam made this point several times that there are a lot of great journalists out there who are writing about these issues and are doing an excellent job. But the problem is that they're not reaching the right audiences or people who don't necessarily know about these issues, right? One of the great ironies of this age is that we have more access to more information than any time in human history, but people don't seek out news sources of information. They just look at their Twitter feed or their Facebook feed. And so if people don't listen to NPR or read The Atlantic, and you have all this great reporting, then how do you reach new audiences, and how do you inform people? Is it media literacy?
If I had the answer,
Right.
I don't know if I'd be sitting here right now. That's a really difficult thing to do. That's one of the things I've tried, as someone who's not a traditional public radio host, didn't spend 20 years in the chair, I'm thinking, how do I bring a different audience to this? How do we get new audiences who aren't traditional public radio listeners, public radio nerds, to tune in? I wish I had the answer. I mean, I try my best to put stuff out as much as I can. I try to share other stuff. What I also try to do is follow people that are, ideologically somewhat different, right? So that I can also see what are the conversations that are happening around me. And we're also trying to do events. So I'll be in Utah in a couple of weeks, right? We were invited to Utah. We're not just going, but we think that's an important, signal, being there and having an event just like this, to be able to get to a place where I think, traditionally public media might not necessarily pay attention to. So I wish I had the answer, but.
I mean, look, historically, you can go back to the to the 19th century, and you'll see newspapers were extremely partisan. They were Republican or Democratic. They fought with each other. But what we have right now is something actually distinct, which is we have an entire alternative media apparatus that is designed to discredit the mainstream media apparatus, regardless of whether or not what it's saying is true. And it has created essentially an alternate universe in which people dwell, in which virtually the reverse of everything that is factually correct is real.
It's referred to as a la carte reality.
And I think that is a distinct problem. That the existence of that bubble is a distinct problem. It didn't start with Trump, but it has certainly sustained him and may continue to do so into a second term. But I think that it's just extremely. I mean, if someone reads like just the most basic news story about politics, and they are convinced that it is entirely made up because of everything else that they're hearing, I'm not sure how you reach that person. I don't like Tanzina. I don't know what the answer to that question is, and if I did, I'd probably be rich. But I do think that there is a unique challenge here that has not existed before.
Michael Rappaport, class of 1985. Thank you for this discussion. I want to ask about the fact that a lot of the stuff that's been going on is just so extreme and so incessant that it's kind of lost its power to shock. I mean, you have a black man gets killed in a traffic stop by a white cop. His girlfriend puts the video on Facebook. Doesn't move the needle in terms of public opinion. Kids get separated from their parents at the border. Doesn't move the needle. A sitting member of the House of Representatives is basically a white supremacist. Doesn't move the needle. So how do you cover these issues, these events in a way that you kind of break through that that numbness, that sense people have? Oh yeah, this is a racist country. We've seen this all before.
I mean, I'm nodding because I agree. I think there is that feeling. I think the way that we try to approach it is, what I see happening a lot in media is, as I said earlier, news is often a commodity, right? And so the media gets excited about something, covers it, and then it moves on, right? Until the next whirlwind, the next big thing. What I think we are trying to do on the show is to zig when everyone's zagging, right? Yes, there are big issues happening every day, but we cannot just drop them when they're inconvenient or not as important, right? And bring them back up when there's a tragedy, right? And I think that's where we need to get better at just being consistent with this, because I think the messaging is one thing. The reality that this is happening, like you said, there are kids in cages, you know. We are doing a segment on the show about Holocaust survivors, and there's an upcoming documentary on PBS. And, you know, you hear the voices of these people who have survived the unthinkable. And I keep thinking, what are they thinking when they look, you know, around the world today? And and it's depressing. I'm not going to lie. It's really intense to think about that. But our job is to continue to not let it die. You know, these are serious issues. And I think treating them as bright, shiny objects is the wrong approach. We have got to stay on them and continue to report them the hell out.
So I just want to say two quick things. One, I don't think it's true that none of those things move the needle. The economy is booming, and the president has never cracked 50% approval rating. I think that there's a substantial part of the country that regards him as completely unfit for office, regardless of what he says or does, and that's in part because of the things that he has said and done. The second thing I would say is, you know, my perspective on this is different whenever people ask me, you know, how do you persuade? So, and the answer is I do not. I never try to persuade anyone. There's a book that W.B. Du Bois wrote called Black Reconstruction in America. And at the time that he wrote it, the scholarly consensus was that Reconstruction was a terrible time of carpetbagger tyranny and Negro rule, and it was just a disgrace, and all the governments were corrupt. And Du Bois writes, and the scholarly consensus, which was established essentially by a professor named William Archibald Dunning and his proteges. He was a Columbia professor.
Right,
he was a Columbia professor. Was this horrible racist historical consensus? And W.B. Du Bois comes out and he writes this incredibly detailed account of Reconstruction. And at the end, he says basically, look, like, I'm not going to convince a lot of people, but this is the actual truth. And then, 50 years later, the historians are looking back and they're like, the only reputable historian of the era is W.B. Du Bois. All these other guys who were prominent in their time are complete hacks, and their history is not to be trusted. So I think the answer is that you can't actually, I don't try to quote unquote reach anybody. I just try to write the truth as best I can, as the way that I see it, and hope for the best. That's it.
And just to add, the Christiane Amanpour's been talking about this a lot lately, to be truthful, not neutral. And I think that's kind of the way.
Only answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We've just a little bit of time, so I have a suggestion that the last two people, if you can ask your question really succinctly, and just ask them in sequentially, and we'll try to deal with them as quickly as possible here.
Okay, actually, mine kind of builds off the prior one, but I guess I deal with three audiences, like people who love what we talk about on a progressive news talk show, people who hate it, and then maybe something in the middle. So building on the breakthrough question, like, do you find particular stories or arguments, or how does data come into play, if any of those strands? Do people respond to data?
Oh, how do I find stories?
No, like, do audiences kind of get you, or like what's kind of getting across to an audience that maybe doesn't normally respond to these topics? Sort of kind of building on the, like, how do you break through to an audience who maybe isn't as engaged as other parts of your audience? Are there particular arguments that work, or particular data, or things you've seen?
I try data. I try to respond when I think it's appropriate, and when it's just insulting, I move on.
Yeah, I'd say more art than science, as Jelani put it.
Okay, so you made some really good points about how journalists who aren't minorities should cover race because of many burdens and things that it puts on it if you expect the minorities to cover that. However, from a different perspective, I'm the mother of a transgender daughter who's 7, and I often see journalists cover, transgenderism is hot now, and I often see journalists completely unintentionally say really offensive things, like they just don't know. And I want to be the one who covers it. When someone else in my newsroom gets assigned a transgender story, I'm pissed, And so is it that it's different for me and than other communities, or how do you put these two things together? ?
Well, look, I obviously, understand and sympathize with your enthusiasm. I think in any newsroom there should be, if you're interested in a topic, there should be conversations about, I think the only thing you can do is communicate with your editors and your colleagues and say, this is something that really matters to me and I want to cover it more. And and there may be other people who feel passionately about it too, who also want to cover. The only way I think is to work that out within your office. But I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to cover an issue you're passionate about. That's exactly how I feel about my work.
And I also think it's something that, you're right, there are a lot of things that are confusing for a lot of folks. It's not something that people understand, language around. I think journalists also have to be honest about their own shortcomings. I've done interviews with transgender individuals, and there was one person I interviewed, and I said, I have some more questions, but I don't think I'm ready for these questions to be prime time. Can we have a conversation so I can have that space to ask you and better inform myself about language, about pronouns, about the medical side to this, like the real questions that if asked in a certain setting could just set things off, but really so that I could better be informed as a journalist, and that person, allow for that space to happen. So I think that's another way for journalists to say, I don't necessarily get this, and I know it's sensitive, and I'd like to be able to do it better.
Yeah, I think Tanzina makes a really good point. It's important to be humble when you are out of your depth, which happens to everyone.
And just to wrap this up, Tanzina and I both teach courses about covering race. And that's the context in which I was saying this, that sometimes you're in a place where there are 12 stories on one topic jumping off. You can't cover all of them. Or when I was covering a lot of police shootings, unarmed black people killed by police. after the 12th story, I was kind of like, I wanted to write a different story. And so the idea is more of having a cohort of people who are well-versed and fluent in these issues and have done the work that would allow them to cover them with sensitivity and accuracy and so on. And so that's more of what I was saying about having a newsroom full of people who understand how to write about these subjects. So I really want to thank Tanzina and Adam, who, outside of like this context, of people who I would just be eager to hear their views anyway. I'm very happy that we were able to do it here, and thank you for coming out today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Jelani. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.